So the Vikings now wants to film James Brown.
Everybody wants James Brown.
Well, you know, James Brown is you. James Brown is you out there. I didn't make James Brown. Thank God that he gave me the energy to carry out the role. But I was just playing a part for humanity, and I'm still playing a part for humanity. That's my role. And my role has gotten beyond a social thing, because a social thing will remain the same until we change it individually. You know what I mean?
Right.
And we got to change ourselves individually, you know. You can't expect people to keep changing it for you. That's like getting your food and asking somebody to eat it for you. It's the same thing you have to do yourself. And I found it out over the 60s. You know, I gave my heart and everything to it.
Nobody knew why James Brown suddenly couldn't sing in 1964. His record label banned him from recording. His biggest hits were pulled from stores. He almost lost everything. Now, a shocking contract from that year reveals what really happened. A secret deal, a massive betrayal, and the fight that changed music forever. This is the story they tried to keep hidden. James Brown was born on May 3, 1933, in a tiny wooden shack in Barnwell, South Carolina. His parents were young and barely getting by. The Great Depression had left families like theirs with almost nothing. They lived in a house with no electricity or plumbing. When James was around 4 or 5, they moved to Augusta, Georgia, hoping for a better life. But things only got harder. His parents split up, and his father left him with his Aunt Honey, a woman who ran a brothel in one of the roughest parts of town. Life with Aunt Honey was anything but easy. The brothel was no place for a child. James saw things no kid should ever see. He wasn't just living there, he had to work. He shined shoes on the streets for a few cents, ran errands, and even helped bring in customers. Money was always a problem. It wasn't until he was 9 that he got his first pair of store-bought underwear. Every day was a struggle, but he didn't complain. He just found ways to survive. Even in the middle of all this, James found something that made him happy: music. He taught himself to play the piano, guitar, and harmonica. Church was one of the only places that felt safe, and gospel music gave him a sense of hope. He also realized something important: people would pay to watch him perform. Soldiers passing through town during World War II would throw him coins if he danced well enough. Even at the brothel, customers would toss money when he put on a good show. Without knowing it, James was already becoming the entertainer he was meant to be. But the streets didn't get any kinder. When he was 12, he was kicked out of school because he didn't have proper clothes. His family couldn't afford decent outfits, and the school wouldn't let him stay. It was humiliating, but James didn't let it break him. If school wasn't an option, he would find another way to survive. He worked harder than ever. He shined shoes, washed cars, and danced for tips near military bases. He even picked cotton in nearby fields. The pay was terrible, but he did whatever he had to do. Music became more than just an escape. He started entering talent shows and quickly made a name for himself. At Augusta's Lenox Theater, he won a competition by performing So Long. Around this time, his father brought home an old pump organ. James had no formal training, but that didn't stop him. He played by ear and kept getting better. Then his life took a sharp turn. At 15, he was arrested for stealing cars. Some say he was just trying to get by. Others think he got caught up in the wrong crowd. Either way, he was sentenced to 3 years in a juvenile reform school in Toccoa, Georgia. For most kids, that would have been the end of the road. For James, it became a turning point. Inside the reform school, he didn't waste time feeling sorry for himself. He formed a gospel quartet with other inmates, including Johnny Terry. Singing gave him a purpose, and it helped him sharpen his skills. It was also where he met Bobby Bird, a young musician whose family would later change his life. The Birds helped get him out early by vouching for him in court. Bird led a gospel group called the Gospel Starlighters, and when he saw what Brown could do, he invited him to join. At first, Brown was just part of the group, but things were already shifting. Gospel was fading. Rhythm and blues was taking over. It didn't take long for them to make the switch. By 1954, they renamed themselves the Flames and started performing across Georgia and South Carolina. Brown played drums and sang backup, but the spotlight kept finding him. His energy on stage was impossible to ignore. Before long, he was leading the group. The way he moved, the way he sang, the raw emotion in his voice. People had never seen anything like it. In 1956, everything changed. It started with a crumpled napkin. Little Richard had written the words, "Please, please, please," on it. And Brown saw something in them. He took that phrase, turned it into a song with Johnny Terry, and refused to let it go. When Federal Records signed them, producer Ralph Bass pushed for the track, but label founder Sid Nathan wasn't convinced. He thought Brown's voice was too rough, too desperate. He nearly nearly fired Bass for wasting his time. But the moment Please, Please, Please hit the airwaves, it took off. The song reached number 6 on the R&B charts and sold over 1 million copies. Brown poured everything he had into every performance. He fell to his knees, sweat pouring down his face, begging the audience with every word. It was electric, but after that first hit, nothing worked. 9 straight singles flopped. The momentum was slipping away. Doubts crept in. The group started falling apart. By 1958, most of the original Flames had left. The money wasn't coming in. The spotlight was fading, but Brown refused to let it go. He rebuilt the group from scratch, bringing in new members and pushing forward. Then, during a stop in Florida, inspiration struck. He wrote a song called Try Me. It was softer than anything he had done before, a plea for love and a second chance. He recorded it in New York with producer Andy Gibson, and when it was released in October 1958, everything turned around. Try Me became his first #1 hit on the R&B charts. It even made it onto the Billboard Hot 100. Just like that, James Brown was back. But survival wasn't enough. Brown wanted control. After Please, 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 it was clear that he was the star. But the rest of the group wasn't happy about it. By late 1957, they had had enough. Most of them walked away. That could have been the end, but Brown saw it as a new beginning. He replaced them with new vocalists, even pulling in members from Little Richard's former group. The famous Flames became his backup. Meanwhile, James Brown, every live show was a high-voltage spectacle that left audiences breathless. He didn't just sing, he commanded, danced, and captivated. They called him the hardest working man in show business for a reason. Brown's performances were pure energy, driven by razor-sharp choreography and an unmatched sense of showmanship. His famous dance moves, lightning-fast footwork, dramatic slides, and gravity-defying splits became legendary. But it was the cape routine that truly set him apart. Inspired by wrestler Gorgeous George, Brown would collapse mid-song, overwhelmed with emotion. His team would drape a cape over his shoulders and help him off stage, only for him to throw it off seconds later and charge back to the mic, as if reborn. The crowd erupted every time. Nothing in his act was accidental. Every step, every spin, every pause was carefully rehearsed. His backup band, the famous Flames, moved in perfect sync with him, creating a seamless blend of sound and motion. Perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. If a musician missed a note or showed up late, Brown fined them. He knew that flawless execution was the difference between a good show and a show that made history. That discipline paid off. Even at small venues on the Chitlin circuit, he performed like he was at Madison Square Garden. When he took the stage at the TAMI show in 1964, he delivered a performance so electrifying that even the Rolling Stones, who followed him, felt like an afterthought. Brown never just played a show, he owned it. No moment captured his magic better than Live at the Apollo. In 1962, Brown was already a force in R&B, but his record label, King Records, refused to fund a live album. They didn't think it would sell. Brown didn't care. He paid for the recording himself. The gamble worked. Released in 1963, Live at the Apollo became one of the most influential albums of all time. The energy of the crowd, the raw intensity of Brown's voice, the way every scream and cheer felt like part of the music. It was an experience, not just a record. Radio DJs played it from start to finish. Fans wore out their copies. It spent 66 weeks on the Billboard charts and peaked at #2, unheard of for an R&B live album at the time. More than just a hit, it changed the music industry. Brown proved live recordings could be more than souvenirs. They could be events, and it gave him something even more valuable: creative control. That control let him push music into uncharted territory. By the mid-60s, he wasn't just making hits, he was inventing a whole new genre. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and I Got You, I Feel Good weren't just songs, they were blueprints for funk. Brown stripped away the excess and put rhythm front and center. The groove wasn't just a background element, it was the song. Tight bass lines, punchy horns, sharp guitar licks, everything locked into place like a machine, and Brown's voice cut through with preacher-like intensity. It was a revolution. Funk wasn't just music, it was movement, attitude, and power. Without Brown's innovations, there would be no Parliament Funkadelic, no Prince, no hip-hop as we know it. But innovation alone didn't make James Brown a legend. It was his work ethic. While other artists took breaks, Brown never stopped. At his peak, he performed up to 335 nights a year. That kind of schedule was unheard of. His band had to keep up, or they were out. If their shoes weren't shined or their uniforms uniforms weren't perfect, they got fined. Brown treated his shows like a military operation because, to him, every performance mattered. That level of dedication made him unstoppable, but it also took a toll. By the late 70s, years of relentless touring caught up with him. The exhaustion, the physical strain, it was inevitable. But even then, Brown never truly slowed down. In 1964, James Brown made a decision that changed music forever. He was frustrated with King Records. Their contracts were strict. Their business methods were outdated. He wanted more control over his music, so he took a risk. He signed a deal with Smash Records, a part of Mercury Records, through a production company he co-founded called Fair Deal. This move gave him a chance to explore new sounds and work under better conditions. His first big release with Smash was Out of Sight. It was more than just a hit. It reached number 24 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 5 on the R&B charts. More importantly, it introduced a new style, sharp rhythms, bold horn sections, a raw energy that would later define funk music. But his decision had consequences. King Records still had a contract with him. They weren't going to let their biggest star walk away. They took legal action and won an injunction. James Brown could record instrumentals for Smash, but he wasn't allowed to sing. For a man whose voice was his greatest weapon, this was a huge setback. He could have waited for the legal battle to end. He could have slowed down. Instead, he did the opposite. He threw himself into live performances. Every night, he gave everything on stage. His shows became legendary. People called him the hardest working man in show business, and he made sure to live up to the name. While lawyers argued in court, Brown was building something bigger. He was refining his sound. He was shaping the future of music. Without vocals, he had to get creative. He started pushing his band harder. The rhythms got sharper. The grooves got tighter. Out of Sight had already hinted at something new. Now, Brown was taking it further. The legal restrictions that should have held him back were actually pushing him forward. He was on the verge of creating a whole new genre. The fight with King Records dragged on, but by 1965, Brown finally broke through. After long negotiations, he signed a new deal. This time, the terms were different. He had more control over his work, more freedom than most artists had ever seen. This was bigger than just one contract. It was proof that musicians could stand up to the system. James Brown didn't just win his own battle. He changed the music industry. His case showed artists that they could fight for their rights. It proved that record labels didn't have all the power. Future musicians followed his lead. They demanded better deals. They refused to be trapped in bad contracts. Brown's fight for creative control shaped the industry for years to come. And for him, this was just the beginning. James Brown wasn't just a musician. He was a voice for change. In 1968, America was boiling with tension. The civil rights movement had made progress, but racial inequality was still everywhere. Then Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April, and cities across the country erupted in grief and anger. A few months later, Brown released Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. It wasn't just a song. It was a declaration. The lyrics spoke directly to the black community, urging people to take pride in their identity and demand the respect they deserve. The recording itself sent a message. Brown gathered 30 kids from Watts and Compton to chant the chorus with him. Their voices shouting, I'm black and I'm proud, weren't just background vocals. They were a symbol of the next generation refusing to be silenced. The song hit number 1 on the R&B charts and broke into the top 10 on Billboard's Hot 100, but not everyone celebrated it. Some white audiences saw it as too aggressive, and Brown admitted he lost a lot of his crossover fans because of it. Still, he never regretted making it. He knew the song was bigger than record sales. 2 years earlier, he took on another major issue, education. Brown had grown up poor in South Carolina. He dropped out of school in 7th grade because he didn't have proper clothes. He knew what it felt like to be left behind. In 1966, when dropout rates among black students were rising fast, he used his music to send a message. He released Don't Be a Dropout with a simple but urgent warning. Without an education, you might as well be dead. He donated every dollar the song made to dropout prevention programs. The impact was so big that President Lyndon B. Johnson invited him to the White House to recognize his efforts. But Brown didn't just talk about the issue. He visited schools, spoke to students, and later set up a trust fund to help kids get an education. Even in his final years, he stayed committed. His last single, Killing Is Out, School Is In, carried the same message. Stay off the streets. Stay in school. His biggest test as a leader came on April 5, 1968, the day after Martin Luther King's assassination. nation. Riots had already broken out in major cities, and Boston was on edge. Brown was scheduled to perform that night at the Boston Garden, but city officials debated canceling the show. They feared it would lead to more violence. Brown had a different idea. He convinced them to broadcast the concert live, hoping it would keep people inside and calm tension. It worked. Thousands stayed home to watch, and inside the venue, Brown became more than a performer. He became a peacemaker. When fans rushed the stage, police stepped in aggressively. Brown stopped the music and told the officers to back off. Then he turned to the crowd. "You're not being fair to yourselves or your race." The audience listened. The tension eased. What could have ended in chaos became a moment of unity. His influence wasn't just in music or activism, he had real political power. Both parties wanted his endorsement because they knew he could mobilize black voters. Though he was a Republican and supported Richard Nixon, he never let politics define his mission. He pushed for funding for black businesses and colleges while working directly in communities, giving food and gifts to families in need during the holidays. Not everyone agreed with his choices. Some criticized him for performing for U.S. troops in Vietnam or for supporting conservative politicians. But Brown didn't care about party lines. He cared about action. He believed in economic independence and education, and he used his platform to push for both. He knew change had to come from all sides. Music could inspire, leadership could unite, and action could turn words into reality. James Brown made his fortune through sheer determination. He was called the hardest working man in show business for a reason. At his peak, he performed nearly 300 shows a year, each one packed with energy that left crowds screaming for more. Over 5 decades, he released 116 songs that landed on Billboard's Hot 100. Every hit added to his wealth. But he wasn't just making money from music. Brown understood the importance of ownership. He bought radio stations, real estate, and even fast food restaurants, always focusing on black communities. One of his proudest moments was buying WRDW, a radio station in Augusta, Georgia. As a child, he had shined shoes outside that very station. Years later, it was his. His music catalog was another source of steady income. Songs like I Got You, I Feel Good, and Papa's Got a Brand New Bag kept bringing in royalties long after their release. At his peak, his fortune would be worth about $140 million today. But Brown's wealth never stayed in one place for long. He lived big, spent big, and trusted the wrong people with his money. He had a lifestyle that matched his success. Private jets, luxury cars, lavish homes. He owned radio stations like WJBE in Knoxville and WEBB in Baltimore, but they weren't always managed well. His finances were just as chaotic as his schedule. He avoided banks, preferring to carry large amounts of cash while touring. He said it gave him control, but in reality, it led to serious financial trouble. By the time he died in 2006, his estate was drowning in debt. Legal battles over his will dragged on for years, delaying the scholarships he had promised for underprivileged children. Despite earning millions, Brown faced serious financial problems. In the late 70s and 80s, he was arrested multiple times for unpaid taxes. The IRS took several of his properties, including his Beach Island estate in South Carolina. His fortune, once estimated at $100 million, shrank due to endless court battles and poor management. It wasn't until 2020 that a settlement was reached. His music rights were sold for $90 million, finally making it possible to fund the scholarships he had always wanted to create. After years of chaos, part of his vision was finally realized. By the late 1970s, James Brown was no longer the unstoppable force he once was. Funk had dominated the early part of the decade, but now disco was taking over, pushing his sound to the sidelines. His albums weren't connecting the way they used to. Critics called them uninspired. His attempts to keep up with new trends felt forced. Fans who had once packed arenas were moving on to something new. His personal life was falling apart too. His marriage to Adriana Rodriguez was full of fights and accusations of domestic violence. In 1973, he suffered a devastating loss when his first son, Teddy, died in a car accident. That kind of pain doesn't just go away. It stayed with him, adding to the weight of everything else. By the 1980s, Brown had no stable record label. His career was slipping away. Every now and then, he reminded the world of his talent. His role in the Blues Brothers in 1980 was a hit. In 1985, Living in America became an anthem. But these moments were rare. They they didn't bring back the success he once had. Behind the scenes, things were getting worse. Brown had developed a serious addiction to PCP. The drug made him paranoid and unpredictable. His once legendary stage presence was now overshadowed by erratic behavior. The world still saw him as a music pioneer, but more and more, his personal struggles became the bigger story. His legal troubles only made things worse. Between the 1970s and 1990s, he was arrested again and again for drug possession and domestic violence. In 2004, at 70 years old, he was arrested for pushing his wife, Tommy Ray Heine, and threatening to kill her. He avoided a jury trial by pleading guilty, but the damage was done. The late 1980s were especially chaotic. Brown was arrested 5 times in just 10 months. His addiction fueled violent outbursts. In one incident in 1998, he fired a rifle at his home in South Carolina, then led police on a car chase. It was eerily similar to the one that had made headlines a decade earlier. And then there were the accusations from former employees. Some claimed he had sexually harassed them. In one case, a jury ordered him to pay $40,000 after firing a woman who had spoken out against him. In 2003, he received a pardon for some of his past convictions, but many believed he didn't deserve it. Then came the infamous 1988 incident, one of the wildest moments of his life. Brown, high on PCP and armed with a shotgun, stormed into an insurance seminar next to his office in Augusta, Georgia. He was furious, convinced that people at the seminar had been using his private restroom. He waved the shotgun around, shouting at the terrified group. Someone called the police. Instead of surrendering, Brown ran. He jumped into his pickup truck and sped off. The chase covered 2 states, with police cars trailing behind him at speeds of up to 85 miles per hour. They shot out 2 of his tires, but he kept going, driving on rims for 6 more miles before crashing into a ditch. Even after being arrested, he insisted he had done nothing wrong. He later claimed the police had fired more than 20 bullets at his car and beat him during the arrest. The fallout was severe. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison for assault and refusing to stop for police. He only served 2 before being released on parole in 1991. The entire incident was so unbelievable that it was later recreated in the 2014 biopic Get On Up. On January 23, 1986, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was the hall's first ever ceremony, and Brown was among the first 10 artists honored. He stood alongside icons like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Ray Charles. His influence on soul, funk, and R&B was undeniable. He had changed the way music felt, the way it moved, the way it hit an audience. Artists like Mick Jagger, Michael Jackson, and Prince had studied his every move. Even as he got older, Brown never slowed down. He performed constantly, pouring everything into every show. His dance moves were sharp, his voice still electric. No matter what was happening in his personal life, legal troubles, arrests, struggles with addiction, on stage, he was still James Brown. His influence stretched across generations. His music became the foundation of hip-hop, sampled by artists like Public Enemy and Dr. Dre. His style could be seen in performers like Michael Jackson and Bruno Mars. On December 25, 2006, he passed away from pneumonia at the age of 73. But his legacy never faded. He was posthumously inducted into the Rhythm and Blues Music Hall of Fame in 2013. Rolling Stone still ranks him among the greatest artists in history. His sound is still alive in funk, soul, hip-hop, and pop. James Brown wasn't just the godfather of soul. He was a movement, a sound, an unstoppable force whose influence is still felt today.